All right. Welcome, folks. We're doing something a little different today where instead of talking about just one product, we're talking about a whole host of them, and they're all going to be related to air conditioning. And so I want to start first just by talking about what air conditioning is, and then I want to move to some cool technologies and products that are coming out related to air conditioning. So, at a really high level, air conditioning is basically just arbitrage. You're using warm air from outside to heat liquid into a gas, and then you're using a state change when that gas becomes a liquid again to create cool air that you can just blow in. So it's compressor and a fan fundamentally, and then a liquid that has a really low boiling point. So you can use that to arbitrage things back and forth. That's how traditional air conditioning works. It's very new. It was invented in the 1900s. It was actually invented to keep humidity down in a printing setting. So we've got this evaporator here and a condenser, and really the way this was initially created was to arbitrage that um, condensation to pull humidity out of the air, so that you could keep like printing paper really dry and crisp in northern areas in the U.S. And so this was invented in the early 1900s, and it's kind of changed the world. This was not something we ever had. And there's a really interesting article I've got linked in the show notes here about how this fundamental change in relating to the environment is altering us. We're starting to live in kind of a global monoculture when it comes to temperature, in terms of interior temperature. And we're also seeing this really widening inequality gap in how we heat and cool ourselves. And it's going to be really problematic. And in part problematic because two kind of natural things that I find really surprisingly impactful are flooding and heat. Heat actually kills the most people in the world every year, and I think flooding is probably second there. These are really powerful forces that we can underestimate, or at least I can, living in the Midwest of the United States where there's not a ton of flooding happening, and it doesn't get too hot traditionally, although that's changing. So I think this is a really important technology. What I'm really going to be looking for here is efficiency, like how can things get better, and then cost, how can things be cheaper. So that's what we're going to focus on in these products. So just a quick note here is there's kind of three sets of solution we're going to look at. And again, here is all of the things I've read about this and all the products. You can find them linked here, which I'll share in the show notes. But really, we've got passive cooling, which we'll talk about first. We'll talk about more efficient cooling next, and then we'll talk about just less need for cooling as well, which is an interesting approach, I think, when it comes to design and designing better buildings for this. So let's dive in. First, one of the most interesting things actually is how to measure this, how much energy we're using. And so I think that for me, I struggle to measure this, what the impact of my AC is on my home, and I live in an apartment. I don't think I'm actually going to be able to figure it out, but for those that can plug in their systems to a smart home energy monitor, you can get a really good idea of what your efficiency is and start to improve it. But starting really simple and inexpensive is these basically using terracotta piping to cool. And as you can see, basically what's happening here is you've got water kind of cascading down through these kind of clay setups. And what's going to happen is, because of the size differences in the clay, and I'm struggling here, I don't fully understand this, the physics of it, you're going to see basically evaporative cooling happen. So you're going to see water kind of condense. It's going to get cooler as a result, and then that air can blow through, and you'll have effectively an AC unit made out of terracotta with just water. So really, really interesting, really low cost. And also, one of the things I think about when it comes to a product is, how can you build this? Like, is it actually constructible in a location? One of the things, I did this thing on bike manufacturing recently, which I'll link in the show notes as well. And that was one of the things I found. I love bikes. I think they're really cool, but they're not really constructible in a single place. Actually, most of them are made in China or Taiwan, which I found surprising, Taiwan particularly. But it's not super accessible. Now, clay is, like, the materials for clay and the process for clay is really well known and really transferable across a variety of geographies. So I think these solutions are really promising and really smart, and you can actually use it in combination with an air conditioning unit and achieve really great efficiency. So really interesting. So this is a very like kind of natural passive cooling solution. Another way of tackling this that's also very low cost is just eliminating how much cooling you have to do. So this is what I've done. I was messing around. Maybe I'll show pictures of my apartment, but I have a lot of strange experiments going on involving yoga mats and aluminum foil to kind of reflect or block sunlight. And I finally just broke and bought some blackout curtains, but these are a really simple solution. They're pretty inexpensive and they can really drop your heating costs because windows are just giant holes in the wall. And not only do they let in heat, they also mess up the insulation. When you think about, a wall has a lot of insulation, the window doesn't have any. And so it's a huge disadvantage. So things like blackout curtains can allow you to let heat in the winter and keep it out in the summer. Awnings are another one that I really love, and in particular, smart awnings I think are super cool. Right, these have lost favor in the U.S., and there's a really great YouTube video linked in that in here just about awnings and the rise and fall of awnings in the U.S. Super interesting stuff. And once again, really pretty cheap. Now, there's some zoning concerns with awnings that are difficult, but for the most part, it's very doable. So I think so far we've kind of talked about two categories of innovation or solutions here. One is passive cooling, which doesn't use electricity and takes advantage of really kind of biomimicry and can be really cheap, really easy to build, which is very exciting. We have kind of preventing heat from getting in, which is one way of keeping things cool. And I talked about, awnings and blackout curtains. You can also do this with building design, which I think is really exciting. So in the South, a lot of homes have wraparound porches, and that's wonderful for enjoying, time outside, but it also shades the first floor really nicely. And so just those simple little things about home design can drastically reduce your, heating costs. And those are difficult to retrofit, which is why I like something like a blackout curtain you can do. Now, one really interesting trend, though, now getting into efficiency and just air conditioning, is air conditioners, as they become more and more important to our kind of modern society, they're becoming a luxury item. So this is like a chic air conditioner, right? You've all seen the window air conditioners that don't look good. This is the like kind of top tier, good looking, unobtrusive air conditioner that's kind of popping up in New York and other big metro areas. And I think it's a really interesting trend to bring like consumer design. I don't think it's going to work. I've seen Nest do this with their thermostat. They also tried smoke detectors. I started a smoke detector company, and I know for a fact that didn't work and was very difficult. These kind of utilities don't tend to do well with consumer, right? There's a lot of regulation around them. It's not easy to install. There's a lot of barriers here. So I ultimately don't think this is going to work. I don't think it's a great... I think this is ultimately, when we think about how to make air conditioning more efficient, I don't think it's a consumer play. I think it's a government or a nonprofit play because of the fact that it takes so much kind of activation energy or investment for someone to get more efficient. And it's one of those tragedy of the commons where individually it doesn't make sense. Like I may only save $5 or $10 a year, maybe probably more than that. Maybe let's say $500 a year on a new air conditioner, but it's going to cost me, $4,000, and it takes me 8 years to recoup that, assuming it's going to even last that long. So I think this is one of those areas where government can really step in. And I think one of the really exciting things when it comes to just an efficiency improvement is called a heat pump. And this company has really done some smart stuff. They've basically made a heat pump window unit. So one of the ways you can improve efficiency is by centralizing air conditioning. So again, the apartment complex I live in is 4 stories, and they have central air throughout, which is much more efficient than a bunch of window units, right? So that's good. That's an improvement. And the next step up would be a heat pump, which allows you to do heat and cooling. But if you're going to run that building wide, that's a huge retrofit that's really expensive. So one way you can handle it, especially in apartment complexes, is doing a window heat pump. So what's really wonderful about this is in one little unit, you get heating and cooling. So heat pumps are using the same principles as air conditioners, but the way they're set up allows it to be reversible. So if we go back to this guy back here, you've got cold air coming out one end and hot end coming out the other. And the way an air conditioning unit works basically is it shoves the hot air out and makes it warmer on kind of the backside of the air conditioner. And you can see this with your refrigerator. If you put your hand up against the outside, it's warmer while the inside's cooler. You can flip that process, right? And that's what a heat pump does. And so this makes it super efficient because you can have everything in one unit. So you drop your maintenance costs. It can run with electric rather than like a furnace is running with gas, which is not great and very difficult then to make more efficient and clean, right? When you're burning something, you can only get more, so efficient. But if you're using electrical current, you can be way, way more efficient. There's less energy loss. So this is super exciting. And also, I like this because it looks good. It's kind of like a consumer product. It's beautiful. And I think this hits the tipping point that this Whisper tech does not, where I think this is a little bit more efficient, but just mostly looks good. This is like a vast improvement and looks good. This is where we start to get to, I'm like, okay, maybe this could be a thing, right? I'm skeptical of this in general. I think utilities are really tough to get into and commodities like this, but this has kind of got me thinking. And if my place did not have central heating and air, I would probably be looking at buying one of these. And okay, so kind of the progression has been very old technologies with the kind of our look here at the Terra and even blackout curtains, right? Those are pretty well proven out. Those are things we're just not using enough and haven't taken advantage of. Then we have like an update on what exists. Next up is the heat pump, which is really well proven out, just not super well distributed. And finally, we get into like the future of heating and cooling. And I have a bunch of articles in here that go into lots of other futures. I'm just going to talk about one product, which is this AirJoule energy and water from air. Now, what's really interesting is, so if we go back to here, we can see, typically we have this liquid to gas transition that is handling the dehumidifying of air, right? So that we can kind of arbitrage that change in state from liquid to gas to cool or heat things, right? But that's only one way of dehumidifying. Another way that Montana Technologies has figured out is they have like a desiccant, like you get when you buy beef jerky, you have that little packet in there that dehumidifies. And so they actually use physical, and I think this is the right one. This might be inaccurate, so bear with me. But one of the new technologies that's coming out is you have a desiccant, like a huge lot of desiccant, and you dry the air during like low, I'm trying to think of non-peak electrical hours. And it allows you then to cool the air when you're using the least amount of energy. I'm really losing how they do this, but basically they're playing arbitrage with separating the dehumidification and the cooling process, and they are then doing the cooling at off-peak hours so that you get more efficiency even though you're using the process. So they are really doing fascinating things, and they're doing it at scale. So I think what's really cool about this, we've kind of talked about all this tech. This is residential, this is residential, this is residential, and this is residential. This is the first one to really start to think about how to do this at a bigger scale. And I'll leave it to y'all to dig into this. But what's funny is, I'm a technical person. I studied electrical engineering, and I ended up with my degree in computer science. But some of this stuff is still really tricky for me to understand. One of the most complicated kind of fields of engineering is thermodynamics, and this is all what it's dealing with. Now, that said, what really excited me about doing this deep dive was seeing how much great technology is already out there. I mean, blackout curtains can have a huge impact, and even just a heat pump and an upgraded experience there can have a really big impact. And this is one of those areas where we can have a big impact in terms of climate change and get a win-win situation where we get more efficient, cooler air, and we have less of an impact on the earth. So if I have one recommendation here after all of this, the thing I'm most excited about are passive heating solutions or passive cooling solutions like blackout curtains or awnings, and then heat pumps. So look into both of those.